Good evening, everybody. Thank you. This is Wednesday, April 19th. We're having a special council public consultation meeting with the community benefits charge. Right off the get-go, I'm going to ask that everybody put their cell phone on silent, please, to reduce any potential interruptions with the meeting. I also wish to extend the regrets of Mayor Dolan and Councillor Saunders, who are both apparently in far better conditions than we are tonight, so I hope they're enjoying themselves. Okay, everybody, welcome to this special council public consultation meeting. This meeting is being live streamed and audio and video recorded and shall form part of the record, which will be retained according to the town's retention bylaw. For more information about the collection, please contact the clerk's office. Our item this evening is a proposed community benefits charge and is being brought forward for information and public consultation purpose only, with no decisions being made tonight. I will now ask Councillor Ices to provide our land acknowledgement statement this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The town of Innisfil acknowledges that Innisfil is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history. The town also acknowledges that this land is the traditional territories of the First Peoples of Turtle Island. It is shared between the Anishinaabe peoples of Beausoleil First Nation, Chippewa of Rama First Nation, and Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. And we thank them for their generations of stewardship. This meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people, and as settlers, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The town acknowledges the forced sacrifices that are the foundation of Canadian society today. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect for all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit.
Thank you, Councillor Ices. We will now go to the approval of the agenda.
Deputy Mayor?
Yes, sir.
Apologies for interrupting. I just wanted to mention we're having some technical issues with the display. Just clerks, I think, would like if we could pause for a moment to see if we can get that straightened out.
Well, I'm more than welcome to. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. We have our technical glitch taken care of. We will now go to the approval of the agenda. Could I have a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Drodge and Councillor Waters, all in favor? All opposed? Passed, thank you. I will now ask Council if there are any disclosures of interest. None being seen. This evening, we will start by hearing from Hemson Consulting Incorporated regarding the proposed community benefits charge. Council may have a few questions or comments, and then we will have an opportunity for public consultation, and we'll hear from members of the public here in the council chambers. We have had known members of the public pre-register to participate electronically this evening. All speakers will have 5 minutes to ask your questions or express your comments. Then staff or the consultant will be able to respond where possible. Should anyone need to speak for a second time to identify an issue that has not already been raised, or to receive clarification, they may be provided with an additional 5 minutes. After all members of the public have provided comment, Council will receive the information. Should any member of the public watching the live stream wish to make a comment, they can email Clerk Services, and these comments will be provided to Council and town staff and taken into consideration before Council makes a final decision. You may also be added to the circulation list as an interested party, where you will be kept updated on any future information regarding the item. The email will be listed on the PowerPoint presentation during the meeting and also available on tonight's agenda that can be found on the town's website. We will now hear from the town clerk, Ms. Patty Toma, on how the public notice of this meeting was provided.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Fowler. Notice of this public meeting was circulated in the newspaper on April the 13th, 2023, and was also posted on the town's website.
Thank you. Has any correspondence been received by the Clerk's Department concerning these proposed amendments?
Thank you again. And yes, 3 pieces of correspondence has been received by the clerk's office concerning this application or this item. First was from Building Industry and Land Development Association dated April 14th, 2023, stating comments and questions concerning the proposed community benefits charge. We also received correspondence from Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre dated April 17th, 2023, expressing comments regarding the proposed community benefits charge. And the last piece we received was from Barb Bagley dated April 19th, stating that council, or a request that council ensure that all possible community benefit charges are collected from developers in order to pay for services required for growth. As well, members of the public may provide comment or register their interest regarding this item during this meeting or up until council makes a decision by contacting the clerk's office.
Thank you, Ms. Toma. Appreciate it as always. We will now hear from Craig Binnings from Hemson Consulting, who will provide a summary of the proposed community benefits charge.
Great. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. It's a pleasure to be before Council and the public this evening. I have a brief presentation that I'd like to go over dealing with the community benefits charge and just to provide information on the strategy itself and also the bylaw that's being put forward for Council's consideration later in the month. I'll talk a little bit about what community benefits charges are, and then I'm going to get into some of the technical details at how we arrived at the capital program, the amount of revenue that might be generated, and the proposed rate structure and a few particulars related to the bylaw, and then finally next steps. Some of you may have not heard of the community benefits charge before. It's actually a new provision in the Planning Act, which is provincial legislation. It's under Section 37. Previously, Section 37 was what we referred to as a heightened density bonusing provision. So if a developer or landowner had a site, and let's say it was zoned to allow a 10-story building, and they wanted to put a 20-story building on it, Section 37 density bonusing allowed a municipality to agree to that request, but at the same time ask the developer to make some community benefits or to provide infrastructure related to the increased needs arising from allowing that increased height and density. What the province has done now is change the nature of Section 37 and made it a broader-based tool, not related to getting increased height and density, but it's still scoped in its application. It is a fiscal tool that municipalities can use to help fund development-related infrastructure, but it's restricted to buildings that are 5 or more stories and have 10 or more residential units in it. So for simple sake, I'll just call that higher density residential built form. It does not apply to ground-related units, things like single detached units or townhouses. It's only buildings 5 or more stories and 10 or more units. And the charge is set at a maximum of 4% of the land value of each specific development. And I'm going to get into the structure of the charge in a few minutes, but that's important consideration under this. It can never exceed 4% of the land value on a particular site. It requires us to do a strategy, which has been available on the town's website. And also you can accept in-kind contributions. So if a developer came forward and said, I'd really like to do a little bit of enhanced park development at this park in adjacent to my building, you could accept that additional contribution and it would offset the CBC payable, but that's purely at the discretion of the municipality. And what can CBCs fund? And I'm going to short form it there, the community benefits charge. And really the legislation is quite wide open in that we can fund any growth or development related capital costs. So remember, it has to be a capital cost and it has to be related to meeting the needs arising from the development that will pay the charge. Working together with staff, what we've identified is a whole series of different kinds of projects that we feel relate to meeting the increase or incremental need arising from this higher density residential built form. It's things like park development and acquisition, urban amenities, streetscaping, urban parks. Think about it we're trying to make these communities to be very livable and enjoyable, especially for those living in higher density built forms. So it's active transportation, public art, heritage, culture, potentially parking, and maybe even affordable housing. We've identified a number of those in the strategy itself, and I'm going to provide a little bit of an overview for them. But once again, there's this important element of the legislation in that there's a nexus test. So the share of the works that we're proposing to potentially fund from CBCs has to be related to the buildings that we're going to collect the money from, those buildings that are 5 or more stories and 10 or more residential units. Remembering that a CBC bylaw can be challenged before the Ontario Land Tribunal, so we have to make sure that it's solid and defensible. CBCs, even though they have this broad base, they cannot overlap with other funding sources, things like development charges. We can fund the same services, but we can't fund the same components of a project. And it's very important that they're aligned. So implementing and administrating a CBC bylaw. There's a requirement under the legislation that we have consultation, but it's not very prescribed about what we need to do. And so basically what we have done is followed what is required under the Development Charges Act. We've had consultations both with the development industry and stakeholders one-on-one. We're holding this public meeting, even though it's not formally required under the legislation. We've given notice of that public meeting, as the clerk indicated, and the information has been available on the town's website. I have already noted that the bylaw would be challengeable before the tribunal, and so we want to make sure it's solid and founded in the legislation. The management of the monies, it goes into what is referred to as a special account or a reserve fund, and can only be spent for community benefits charge types of amenities, the kinds of things outlined in the strategy itself. In addition, what you have to do, the municipality annually will have to spend or allocate 60% of the money in that special account every year. The allocate is important because you can still save up the money to build a larger project that may not occur to 2, 3, or 4, or even 5 years down the road, but every year you have to spend or allocate that money. And there's annual reporting requirements for how the monies have come in, what you spent them on, and what you've allocated to them. There's also the requirement to update or review the strategy at a minimum every 5 years. And what we're proposing to do here, I think many of you recognize we've also been retained to work with the town on updating your development charges background study. We're going to update and refresh the strategy when that's complete to make sure that they're lined up and that there's no double counting. The CBC strategy process is relatively straightforward. We look at how much development is going to occur of the type that would be subject to a CBC charge. And then we say, well, what are the incremental needs arising from that type of development? And then we say, what portion of that capital cost relates to the needs of the CBC buildings? And we look at those costs and we identify them in the strategy. And also what we've done is made an estimate of how much revenue we think you're going to generate over the planning horizon. And I'm going to get into some of those specifics over the next couple of slides. So once again, we're looking at the forecast of development that's going to occur, and we're using a planning horizon of 10 years, 2023 to 2032. We're assuming that you're going to add about 5,700 apartment units in CBC-style buildings, those that are 5 or more stories and have 10 or more units. A large share of those units would be in the Orbit Secondary Plan area. And our forecast of units is based upon the SIMCO Municipal Comprehensive Review forecast, but also informed by the draft Orbit Secondary Plan, recognizing that many of the units will be within that. And we're also going to make it aligned with the development charge background study, which is underway, including the forecast contained in that document. This is somewhat difficult to read on the slide, and I apologize to you for that and to the public. There is more information in the background strategy that's available on the town's website. What we've done here is summarize the projects that we're considering for funding from CBCs. You can see that we've got 16 different areas, many of which I've already outlined for you, and the totality of that program over the 10 years is in excess of $50 million. There's some shares of that project that we recognize will benefit your existing residents and are not development related at all. So we remove about $5 million of that cost. And then there's some other funding recognized or related to other needs. And so we remove about another $5.5 million. So of the $50 million, we're saying just over $40 million or almost $41 million, in our opinion, is related to the needs arising from CBC buildings. That's the capital side of things. Unfortunately, when I get into the revenue, we're not going to generate that kind of money. And so what I'm going to talk about now is the rate structure itself. As I indicated, The legislation only guides us and says that the application of the CBC cannot be 4% of the land value for any specific development. It doesn't tell us how to structure the rate. Many of the CBC bylaws that are out now set it at 4% of the land value, and that's what I talked to you last time I was before you. Through discussions with the development industry, and just to provide some simplicity moving forward, what we're coming forward with is a recommendation to have a per unit charge. That per unit charge would be $1,200 per unit in the Orbit Secondary Plan area and $800 per unit elsewhere in the town. And that's based on some analysis of land values that have been informed by other local jurisdictions, and we do that on a per unit basis and set it at the 4% cap. So overall, we think that that's going to generally reflect the land values at 4%, but we're going to set the rate at that. But we're also proposing through the bylaw to continue to allow the town to use the option of going out and getting an appraisal on any specific site and setting the CBC at 4% of the land value. And also the developer who is subject to the CBC has a complaint mechanism available to them. If they feel the charge is too high and offends the 4% cap, they can go out and get an appraisal, submit it to the town complaint, and then there's a process to resolve the difference. This next slide just provides you with a summary of our expectation about how much revenue might be generated over the next 10 years. So in the Orbit Secondary Plan, at the $1,200 per unit and 5,200 units, that would generate about $6.3 million. Other areas of the town, we're only expecting you to add about 500 units in CBC buildings, and at the $800 per unit would generate about $250,000. So a total of about $6.5 million. Far below the $40 million in costs that I identified for you earlier. So it's not a massive revenue source, but it's an important one which will help create these complete communities and make your communities more livable, especially in higher density areas. This next slide just provides you with a summary of comparable kinds of rates that are established elsewhere in select jurisdictions. I think there's now about 20 municipalities that have CBC bylaws in place, recognizing that it's a very new tool. The first bylaws were only passed in the summer of last year. More and more municipalities are looking at it. Many are at the 4% value, but many of those per unit estimates are not dissimilar to yours. You're at the lower end, recognizing that land values in the GTA can be significantly higher than what we would expect to see here in Central Simcoe. Just to sort of wrap up, I just want to illustrate once again that I've identified about $40 million worth of costs that we think would be eligible for CBC funding. But our expectation about the revenues that you're going to generate over the next 10 years are more like $6.5 million. And so you're going to have to choose and allocate that money and spend it in those critical areas, and that'll be part of your important annual deliberation in spending and allocating the CBC monies. Just to wrap up with where we've been and where we're going, the strategy and the bylaw have been available since March 24th. We're holding this public meeting today. As the clerks indicated, we've received some submissions, from Build, which we received early on. We've already begun reviewing and assessing, and we'll be providing a response to that one and the others. And it's likely that we're going to make some fine-tunements to the strategy to reflect the comments that we've received from the development industry. And then we're looking to bring back a bylaw for council's consideration at the end of the month. And Deputy Mayor, that's the end of my formal presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Biddings. Are there any questions from council? Councilor Waters?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. My question has to do with, the town has always had community benefit charges. Am I correct or not?
So I don't believe that the town has ever utilized Section 37, the old Section 37 provisions. You may not have even had an opportunity to. So this would be a new kind of charge for the town.
The reason I'm asking is because I remember sitting down with Tim Kane, our past Director of Planning, and mentioned that we were talking about development in downtown Alcona, and he mentioned that there were community benefit charges that we could lay in terms of to encourage builder to do a green roof or something like that. So I've heard the term before, and so I'm a bit confused in terms of whether it has or has not been used in Innisfil before, or whether we've had that opportunity. So I'm just looking for some clarification whether it's really new or not.
Mr. Millingen?
Through your chair. My understanding, it predates me, but my understanding is we didn't use, the community benefit charges weren't in existence under the existing legislation. This is new legislation, as Mr. Binning said. Section 37, we did apply to Friday Harbor. There was a bonusing density consideration back then, and we did apply Section 37 at that point in time.
Thank you.
Councillor Ices?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering about the categories that are defined in the report. I guess a couple questions on them. One, how did the project costs, how did those numbers come to be? And if there was another category that we wanted to add in the future, how that mechanism might work?
Yes, through the chair. What we did was we worked together with staff and we identified the different kinds of projects areas. And then, for example, within additional active transportation network, we looked at potentially how many additional lane kilometers or meters of different types of infrastructure we might want to fund, and added and put a unit cost to that. Public art, how many pieces might you acquire over a 10-year period, and an established cost estimates based upon either past practice or was informed by studies that we've done elsewhere. The list that we've identified now is important, but also, as I indicated, when you have to refresh it every 5 years, at a maximum you can allow that to, or a minimum amount every 5 years. You can then introduce new categories or new types of projects within the categories that we've identified. In addition to that, we're going to refresh this again later in the year, and if something else has been identified through the development charge study process or others, we could modify this list and it would be supported by the bylaw moving forward.
Any other questions? Councillor Waters?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. If I could ask you to pull up, you had a list of items, I can't remember what it was, but it said no longer funded by DC. There was a, yes, that's the one, yes. So my question is, affordable housing says no longer eligible for development charge funding. So have some of the charges that we are allowed to do under DCs now under this? And are we whole? This is because we're limited to a cap of 4%. Will we get the same cash available or benefit?
Yes, through the chair. The affordable housing one is somewhat different. That was, the county was significantly impacted by removing housing as a service from the development charges because they levied the development charges for the housing that they constructed. It's definitely not a service that's eligible for DC funding, but the town has never used that tool for that. It did use it for parking and also for general studies, which are no longer DC eligible. We put them in this mix, but as I've indicated, it's going to be a more limited revenue source, so you're not going to be able to fully fund the gaps created by the changes under the Development Charges Act.
So are municipalities then on the hook for those? Do we have to find revenue sources to cover those off then?
The short answer is yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Councillor Ices?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was curious about the experiences other municipalities had with the appraisal route of determining value. To me, that seems a more complicated route than just the cost per unit. And with the experience I've had with appraisals is there's always a question as to their validity somewhat, and I would think the Ontario Land Tribunal would be a route that a lot of land project owners would go to, and it just curious if there has been some examples on that.
Yes, through the chair. It's still early days, but a number of them I know have gone forward. different municipalities are taking different approaches. Some are doing the appraisals themselves or retaining appraisers to do them. Others are having the developers bring forward the appraisal. And then a number of municipalities that use what we refer to as the alternative parkland rates for getting parkland cash in lieu. It requires an appraisal of the site as well, and it's at the same point in time. So some municipalities were already doing extensive appraisals or having their developers do them, and they'll use the same appraisal for the purposes of parkland cash in lieu as they will for CBC. So the approaches and the mechanisms were in place. Others that are smaller, like yourselves, and haven't dealt with parkland cash in lieu in the same way and are getting into it, that's why here we're proposing a bit of a hybrid approach to get a per unit charge in place and then see how that works and do some appraisals over time and make sure that it's establishing and collecting the maximum amount of money that you can through this tool.
Any other questions? That being said, I have a few myself. If we can go to slide 10, please. All right. You're saying that in the transit-oriented community, you're doing $1,200 per unit. Now, is that based off the hectares, number of units per hectare? Like, because on the slide here it says based on, you take a look at, was it Halton Hills, based on 3.95 million per hectare land cost and density of 100 units per hectare. Are we using that same sort of formula to get the 4% on that level?
Well, what we've done is we have a sample of different properties in general geographic proximity to Innisfil, and we have the details on what the land value were and the number of units under that particular development application, and use that to arrive at a value per unit. The approach used in Halton Hills is somewhat different. It's taking a more generic approach and using an overall assumed average land value and then the density assumption to arrive at. We did some cross-checking that way against using actual data from site developments, but that was our approach as opposed to the more land value approach.
So in essence, the $1,200 for the transit-oriented community in the orbit is the hard number that we're going to be using in the bylaw?
Correct.
Okay. The second one, a question I have, is if you go back to the list, I think Councillor Icy's had it up before with that one, yes. I'm looking at public realm. That's a rather vague terminology. Is that on purpose, or what does that entail?
Yes, and there's some additional details in the strategy by what we mean by public realm. That's more of an overall title to it. And so we're thinking about things that could be enhanced streetscaping, wider sidewalks, nice planting materials, enhanced lighting mechanisms, just creating that nicer public realm in higher density neighborhoods to create a safety, a health, and a community element to it.
And one last comment, if I may. I'm looking at this, and the one thing that comes across is that although we can't use these in lieu of DC charges, what we're getting is a lot of on top of the services to make it more livable in the community as opposed to making it livable in the community, if that makes sense. So I understand what's going on. I'm just wondering, is there a way in the future, do you see any way that we might be able to, as Councillor Waters asked before, where we cannot use the DC charges due to Bill 23, is there a way we might be able to transfer some of the funds or create a cross connection with that to ease the burden with the long term? Is that even feasible under the bylaw? The reason I'm asking is because when this was put into play, Bill 23 was on the back burner at the moment, and now it's coming to the fore, so we're seeing the long-term effects. So I'm just wondering if this can be a tool that handles more than the surface, for lack of a better term.
Yes, it's an excellent question through the chair. And that's one of the reasons why we've recommended that we refresh the strategy as we move through the development charge process, because if we're finding there's gaps and shortfall through the DC funding because of Bill 23 and the other limitations, can we use CBCs to try to fill some of those gaps in addition to addressing incremental needs arising from higher density built form? So that is part of the intention through this process.
And one last question, if I may. The 4% cap, whose standard is it being used to measure by? Like, I mean, is it provincial, is it, or like, are we doing it through third party? Like, who's defining that 4% in this particular scenario?
Well, so the 4% itself is set in the legislation. The application to a particular development site would be done through an appraisal process if we were going to go down that approach. And recognizing that a developer, if they feel the 800 or 1,200 per unit creates a total cost to them that's greater than 4% of their land value, there's the dispute mechanism. They have to get an appraisal, bring it into you and say, listen, you've offended it. You then have the option of getting your own appraisal and saying, no, we think it's still fine. If they're within 5%, you take the lower. If there's a difference, then there's another mechanism to resolve it. So if you're using the 4% as the basis for your charge, you do need to have an appraisal mechanism in place.
All right, so what I'm asking for clarification, if I may, this is done by a neutral third party, not the town, not the developer themselves. It's someone who's removed from the process and acting as an individual agent, correct?
Correct. And one of the requirements under the Act is that you have to have 3 appraisals retained and identified to address CBC complaints and appraisals.
Thank you. All right, if that's everything, thank you, sir. I appreciate your time. We will now hear from members of the public who have questions or comments. Ms. Clerk, do we have anybody who's looking to speak?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. What you can do is ask if any member of the public would like to come to the podium, and I believe that Mr. Rayner had sent in notice that he would be coming to speak during this time.
Thank you. Mr. Rayner, the mic is yours.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, members of council, delightful to be here again. It still feels like home, and I'm just so happy to have the opportunity to present tonight. And I just want to applaud staff and council for moving so quickly on the community benefits charge opportunity. The challenge of having growth pay for growth seems to be continuing to get harder and harder and harder. And certainly residents who live here now, don't want to have to pay for new infrastructure that's coming as a result of the number of people that are coming to the community. On Monday, our CEO and President, Gail Hunt for the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre, sent through a letter to you, Mr. Deputy Mayor and council members. I assume you have that letter, so I won't go over it in great detail. Do you have the letter, Deputy Mayor? No, okay. So I'll just very briefly, the suggestion from RVH, just as we move more and more to support community health and wellness, we're looking at ways for those things to be funded because, of course, the revenue side of healthcare and wellness in our community is limited as well. So we read with great interest the strategy, and we think it's really robust, and obviously Hemson knows exactly what it's doing in terms of recommending to you the different categories and working with the staff team. But we had 2 main sort of recommendations for your consideration, Deputy Mayor, members of council. The first is to consider broadening the strategy to include health and wellness as a specific health and wellness infrastructure, and facilities in the strategy itself, to provide you and future councils with the greatest flexibility, depending on what kind of projects you want to put into the strategy moving forward, and to really set the stage for future health and wellness funding. And of course, in many communities that Craig would present in, there isn't the same kind of connection between municipal and health and wellness, but the town, as you all know very well, owns the Rizzardo Health and Wellness Center, so you've already moved into this space of health and wellness, so why wouldn't you capture it in this strategy? And if that's more complicated because it sort of puts a big flashing light on a type of infrastructure and category that perhaps other strategies don't have, and perhaps then attracts attention that you may not want, adding health and wellness facilities under the community facilities heading might be a simpler way to address the strategy. But I'm sure staff and Mr. Binning and Hemson can come up with better ideas than RVH can on this. But we just wanted to provide that recommendation to you. there's no doubt that, I think if the council of 10 years ago had had an opportunity in front of them to help fund Risardo, notwithstanding that there was a number of really creative ways to recover revenue and capital costs through expanding that facility, I think they would be very interested in it. So I encourage you to sort of think about 10 years from now and what might be coming down the pipe and creating that foundation of funding for health and wellness. Happy to take questions, Mr. Deputy Mayor, but just wanted to thank you very much for the opportunity tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Rayner. Does anybody on council have any questions? Okay, thank you, sir. Just to note again, we've had no members of the public pre-register to participate electronically. So we're now going to the recommendation to receive the comments provided this evening. I'm going to need a mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Richardson and Councillor Drudge. All those in favor? All those opposed? Perfect. Thank you. Carried. Thank you to everyone who has taken time to participate in this presentation regarding the proposed community benefits charge. Anyone who wishes to provide comments may still do so and may register as an interested party to be contacted before this item is considered by council. Please contact the clerk's office at one word, at innisfil.ca. Council thanks everyone for their participation, and we will now go to the confirming bylaw. I need a mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Richardson, Councillor Zanella, all those in favor? Okay, carried. And then motion to adjourn. All right, Councillor Drudge and Councillor Richardson. All those in favor? Carried.